Thank you all for joining us today. We are here to celebrate World Migratory Bird Day, participating in the Maryland Bird Day live event. This is the disembodied voice of Aurelio Gianetti, the education director at the Ward Museum.
I'm Dom Tartaglia, and I'm the curator and folklorist at the Ward Museum.
And our special guest today is, do you want to introduce yourself?
Well, my name is Larry Barth. I'm from Western Pennsylvania, but I've been coming down to the Ward Show and the Eastern Shore for what seems like my whole life.
Fantastic. And we have brought Larry in because he's a very, very special guest. He is a world-renowned artist whose specialty in bird sculptures is, I would argue, probably unmatched. At our annual Ward World Championships, Larry has won 17 times in 50 years, which means that he's won more than once every 3 years. That is the highest number of wins at the championship of anybody who has ever participated. So Larry's, we're very, very happy to have you. Thank you so much for coming down to chat with us today about your life, your work, and what inspires you and what your philosophy is and why you do this. So I guess to get things started, I'm kind of curious, and you can keep this, I'm going to keep this as vague as possible because I'm curious to hear how you respond, but why birds?
Well, I get asked that fairly regularly, and it's probably the one question that I don't have an answer to, in that I've never questioned it. It just is. I've been interested in birds my whole entire life. I cannot remember a time when I wasn't. Earliest memories I have are of birds, when I'm just a child, single digits, under 5 probably. And I remember birds around our home. At that time, we were in Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin, and I remember them vividly. I remember that gull against, a white gull against a blue sky. I remember seeing a great blue heron way off in the distance. I'm not sure I even knew what kinds of birds these were, but I remember the image. I remember some ducks taken off from a bend in the river, which I didn't know it at the time, but the detail is crisp in my mind, and I've come to realize that those were most likely hooded mergansers. That fits. So it's simply always been birds. My mother was interested in birds, and she had 2 sisters, my aunts, who were avid bird watchers. So I think I was simply born with it, part of heredity. And I've never questioned why birds, because it was just such an obvious thing that birds were special to me. And that has been a constant in my work. What I do, whether I'm sculpting or painting, no matter what material I'm working with, wood, metal, or anything else, 2D, 3D, it's always been birds. And as I have discovered new outlets and new materials, my work has followed suit. And I started carving birds when I was about 14. I was very interested in birds. I was very interested in art. And I graduated through, working from crayons to clay to watercolor to pen and ink and on up the scale. And I eventually made a transition from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. And back in the 70s, bean porcelain birds were quite popular, and you could see them in fine jewelry stores. These were limited edition porcelain, 3-dimensional, very intricate, very detailed sculptures, and they fascinated me. They really gripped me. But I was 14, and there's technical hurdles that keep a 14-year-old from going home and firing up porcelain in his bedroom. But my dad was a woodworker. He's a civil engineer by profession, but a woodworker as a hobby. And his specific interest in woodworking was in carving. So, though I couldn't just start working in porcelain, I could go down in the basement and find a piece of wood and use my dad's chisels, and I could start carving birds. I didn't know any other bird carvers. It was simply my interests and what was available to me coming together, and I started carving birds. And I carved birds for a couple years without any outside influence. All my birds were 2 inches thick because I started with a plank from the picnic table, sugar pine blank, and if it was a chickadee, it was life size. If it was a pheasant, it was miniature. You know, everything came out of the same thickness of wood. And I didn't know what I was doing. When you needed to make feet, you went to the hardware store and you wandered the aisles until you found something that worked. I carved the eyes right out of the block, no glass eyes like everybody is using. And I carved for 2 years without knowing another bird carver. And I got better, but it was at a snail's pace. And at that 2-year mark, that's when I bumped into the Ward show and saw that there were others. And not only were there others, there were lots of others, and they had been attending the show and the competition, and that competition had driven them to improve their skills, which is what competition does. And they were just way ahead of me. But what I found is I could do what they were doing. It just had not occurred to me to take it that far on my own. I was proceeding at a snail's pace. And once I saw the work that was being done, my work just came up overnight, and I knew that this is what I was going to do. And I started entering the competition the next year, and haven't looked back since.
Amazing. So I'm curious, we've got a couple of your pieces kind of sitting in front of you. Do you want to tell us maybe
these are
a little bit about these?
A couple of the more portable ones. We'll take them in order because this piece I did the year before I did this piece. So the green heron here, it's appropriate for the Eastern Shore. I hear that you just declared the great blue heron the state bird, is it?
The city bird, the Salisbury City bird is
okay.
the great blue heron.
Well, this isn't a great blue heron, but a great blue heron is a good choice because those tall, elegant waders are such a iconic match to the Eastern Shore. And I've always liked herons quite a bit. Most of my pieces up until this time, to the time that I did the green heron, had involved elaborate settings, habitat. Sometimes it was a more a part of the piece than the bird was. The bird needed to be there, but the habitat could have taken as long or longer than it took to make the bird. So the green heron was quite a departure for me, and at that point my thinking was to make this bird seem as real as possible, I'm going to eliminate all the things that would tell you otherwise, all the things that would tell you that it's a carving. The base, the setting, in a contained, designed way. All those things tell you this is a carving, this is a representation of the bird rather than the real bird. And it occurred to me that in all the times that I've spent out in the field observing birds, I had never seen one on a hand-polished black walnut base. They're just out there. And so my thinking was, I'm going to do a bird that's simply there, as if a green heron just happened to walk by. That's all you'd have, is a green heron on whatever he happens to be standing on. So my effort to make the bird seem as real as possible, I eliminated everything else so that the bird stood alone, just as the real bird does. And that was, I didn't know how that would go over. I was actually surprised when it won because the pieces that it was in competition with towered over it. It was the smallest thing there, but it commands the space around it more than a piece that brings its composition and its habitat with it. I think that's what happens. If you have habitat, you've created a vignette. And this piece, having no habitat, it expands and uses the space around it, and it just becomes part of the entire outdoors. So I felt good about the piece. I entered it in world class because I wanted it to be seen on the stage, that stage, so to speak, and was surprised when it was well received down here. And then the piece that I did the year after that was this piece. It's a ruddy turnstone and purple sandpipers. The title of the piece is Tidal Companions. And it is extremely tied to the eastern shore, because the very first year that I came down here and saw the show was the fall of '75. And I've always been a bird watcher, and I still have the little piece of paper that has a list of the birds that I saw that day, and birds that were seen for the first time in the year get underlined in red, and birds that I've seen for the first time in my life get written in red. And on that little piece of paper, I have ruddy turnstone and purple sandpiper side by side in red. It was the first time that I'd ever seen them. And I saw them together, and I thought it was a great combination. They were on the rocks, and this was at the south end of Ocean City. And I just said, that's a piece I want to do. That was 1975. And the date on this piece is 2000. So it was 25 years from start to finish. A lot of people ask me how long it takes to do one of these, and I have two answers to that. One is how long did the execution actually take? And the other answer is how long was the concept in gestation, so to speak. So 1975, I see the birds, I think about it, I have documentation of my thought process through 25 years. A false start, I made a clay model, it was too big, I was trying to carve too much. I had a dozen birds in the piece, and then it went dormant, and it wasn't until I was doing these simpler pieces that I came up with a concept of sort of this visual shorthand of taking a large scene and sectioning it into this one little bit. And by sectioning it so cleanly, I think that makes it easier for you to fill in the rest in your mind's eye. And what I discovered is I didn't need to do a dozen birds in order to convey this idea. A turnstone is such a bright and colorful bird that one bird sort of said turnstone. I didn't need 6 of them. And the piece became simpler, and consequently it did get done. And that is the longest. I've done bigger pieces, I've done bigger birds, but this would be the longest sort of documented start to finish. Because when it comes to the question of how long does this take, it was 25 years from initial inspiration to final execution. I did the piece in 2000, so did it take me 25 years or 4 or 5 months? I think the answer is both.
Amazing. I've actually heard that so many times, and I feel like every single carver has such a complex response to that question, because how do you capture that entire process? And I'm kind of curious, so when you're actually working up that piece, once you know what it is that you want to do, once you've got an idea of what it looks like, what is the kind of study and prep process for that look like? I mean, I know you don't achieve this level of extreme realism without seriously taking a hard look at the birds themselves. So what does that process look like?
Well, almost all of my work, and these two are examples, are the result of field work. I'm in the field and I'm seeing things. I keep two sketchbooks, two series of sketchbooks. One are my field books, and those are the ones that I take with me into the field. And in them I sketch what I'm seeing. I may not have any carving in mind. In fact, I don't. I'm simply recording what I see, because I find that sketching makes me a better observer. If you go out there with a camera, well, if I go out there with a camera, somebody who's a photographer probably feels differently. But if I go out there with a camera, there's a tendency to snap the shot and tell myself I can study it later when there's more time, because I have the shot. But when I have a sketchbook and I sketch what I see instead of photograph it, it forces me to slow down and look harder while the bird is still in front of me. Because until you go to draw something, you don't realize what you haven't seen, even though you've looked at it intensely. So I rely heavily on a sketchbook rather than a camera when I'm in the field to record what I've seen. That's one series of sketchbooks. Everything in it is something that was in front of me while I made that sketch, or it got back to the sketchbook as quick as I could after I saw it. Then my studio sketchbooks, it's not what I've seen, it's what I'm thinking about. They're more like doodle pads, you know. I'm in my studio and I'm thinking about what I've seen, and I'm just thinking, and I draw whatever I feel like drawing. And a lot of times the ideas, the images that are in my field books cross over into what I'm thinking about, and that's where my pieces come from. When an idea from the field crosses into my studio sketchbooks repeatedly, then I start taking note and realize this is something that I ought to consider. And I do study the birds, the live birds if possible. I live near a banding station. That gives me the opportunity to hold live birds and see them and record details in a different way than in the field. If I see a bird in the field, I'm paying attention to gesture, you know, how it holds its tail, you know, is the head high or low, that sort of thing, you know, the overall posture of the bird. But the bird in hand, I start noting the details, and you see both of those views coming through in my work. I try and get the characteristic gesture, but then I also back it up with the detail that comes from time with the actual bird. I borrow study skins from Carnegie Museum of Natural History. That gives me a feather map, but it's not a taxidermy mount. It's a study skin. Study skins, there's no attempt to make them look lifelike. They sit side by side in a drawer with cotton for eyes, and it's simply the preserved plumage of the bird. And that's what I would like to work with, because I don't want to be duplicating any mistakes that taxidermists might have made. So I rely on the study skin. That has a huge amount of information, but I rely even more on my own observations that I've made in the field from the live bird. So with those resources, then I set about working the piece up in clay. I make a clay model of everything before I move to wood. The reason being, wood is a subtractive medium. You can only take it away. It's a one-shot deal. Clay is additive and subtractive. You can take it off, say, oops, put it back on. Clay gives me the freedom to really make changes. And I make all my changes in clay when I can. And when I finally like my clay model, that's when I'll move to wood. And then I'm simply duplicating my clay model, using my clay model as my guide, and now carving in wood.
Excellent, excellent. So I guess I'm kind of curious about, like, what is the I hate to use the word success rate, but what does that process, that iterative process, look like? When do you know that you've got it right? When do you know that you've got the right bird, the right gesture, and everything, so that way you know that you want to devote the time to carve that into wood?
Well, that's why a piece like this took 25 years. 24 and a half of that, 24 and a half years of that was waiting for everything to be just right, continuing to simmer. I'm a firm believer in your subconscious, and I have the luxury of being able to plug problems into my subconscious, introduce myself to the issue, introduce myself to Ruddy Turnstone's Purple Sandpipers, say I'd like to do that, and then I may force it, I may work on it, I may try and work up a composition, but it may not seem right to me, so it goes on the back burner and I do something else. But it's still simmering on the back burner. My subconscious is working it. And if a lot of problems, if I know that if I try and solve them directly, if I just sit down and say I'm not stopping until I nail this, I may spend a ridiculous amount of time producing nothing. I'd rather plug the problem into my subconscious and then go work on something else. And usually, eventually, a solution occurs to me seemingly out of the blue, but it's not out of the blue. It's an amalgam of what I introduced to my brain and what my brain did with it, and it factors in everything that you experience and look at and see along the way, and eventually the solution comes. And I try not to force it. I'd rather not force it. There's times when a deadline is pressing and you have to get on with it, but given the luxury of being my own boss, a lot of times I can just wait until it does seem right. And I don't know how to, there's no equation for it, but I can tell you that when it does seem right, you know it. When all of a sudden one day you wake up and something occurs to you that just makes it all fit, and you're as excited as can be because it finally fits. Everything's perfect. Nothing is unresolved, and then it's full speed ahead.
That's fantastic. And you know what I think is very fascinating when you're talking about that is you have that moment where you know that it's right. And how do you know, I guess maybe you don't know, but I guess do you know, or how do you intuit that's going to connect with other people? Because obviously your pieces connect with other people. You wouldn't have won so many awards, you wouldn't be having pieces commissioned by museums and collectors and all these things if you weren't connecting with people. So how do you know that you're making that connection?
Well, I don't always. Like the green heron, I felt good about it. It's where I wanted to go artistically, but I didn't expect it to go over well at the award show, where everything was a big habitat extravaganza. I thought it might be seen as just too spare. It turns out that it struck a chord with people. That's very gratifying, but it's not my goal to make work that appeals to other people. It's my goal to make a piece that appeals to me. And I do consider myself extremely fortunate in that my efforts to please myself have been well received. But that isn't what I'm shooting for. I just keep trying to figure out what I think the best thing that I can do is, and let the chips fall. If people like it, great. If they don't like it, that's okay, because I like it.
It does. So I personally know from experience that the works have a lot of resonance with people. Working within education, I have led so many field trips through the museum, and I've seen the way everybody from, a 5-year-old in a kindergarten class
Yeah.
up to, an adult tour just connect with these pieces. I've watched, a group of 15, 7-year-olds just gawk at your snowy owl and just be kind of stunned and just practically study the thing. So it's amazing to see that that your personal vision has that kind of
Well,
connection.
I think I've benefited from liking birds so much because I think everybody likes birds. If I had, as a 5-year-old, decided that I was just absolutely fascinated with fungus and spent my life pursuing the art of fungus, and I don't know that I would have achieved what I've done when I have been fascinated with birds, because it just is a natural way of reaching people. Birds they're just spectacular. Plants are even more prominent in the environment, but of the living things, birds are the most accessible. If you're really excited about mammals and predators, let's say you're fascinated with wolves, it's hard to get a look at some of these things. They're very secretive or very remote, but birds, you can see birds almost everywhere. So they just lend themselves to good public relations.
So what sort of connection do you think people are maybe having in their own brains when they're seeing these pieces and the way it connects them to wildlife? Do you think there is that connection between the carved piece and the wild piece, or?
Well, I think so. People who are familiar with the birds, I think, will look at my carvings and see old friends, birds that they know too, and they might say, yep, that's exactly what it looks like, and so that's a connection. But I think that's the easy one, because they're already in your camp, they're already interested. What I enjoy is the reaction of folks who aren't necessarily as into birds as I am, but it can stimulate that interest. I think that's a special ability that art has. Art, I don't consider art to be a luxury. A lot of people think that art is something high up on the scale and you can't deal with art until you're rich or something like that. But it's just not that way at all. Art is basic. We all need art just as much as we need food and water. If you go without food and water, you're probably going to fade away quicker than without art. But without art, you will fade away. Our art feeds our souls, and I think that art is a way of making people who aren't necessarily as interested in the natural world or conservation issues, it brings them along. A good example would be a project that I participated in a number of years ago. It was a European group called Artists for Nature, and they used art to directly approach conservation issues. The idea was, it's hard to get people excited about a swamp. Too many people think of it as a wasteland. You send artists into that swamp, they see the beauty of it, and they produce artwork from it, and the public sees the artwork, and they can recognize the value that the artwork brings about that they never saw just going by that swamp. So it sort of backtracks, and I think when you see artwork done by someone who obviously cares about it tremendously and has really put themselves into it, it causes you to examine what they spent their time with a little more carefully. So I think that the artwork that's here at the Ward Museum, what I do, painters, sculptors, I think art can open people's eyes to a beauty that previously was hidden to them. And so once you see the artwork, you find yourself in the field looking at birds a little harder, because clearly someone thought that that was worth doing. So I think that artwork is a tremendous conservation tool to make people aware and care about their environment.
I don't think I can top that. Dom, you got a question? Fantastic.
Well, yeah, so that kind of strikes me as what art can do for science, but in your opinion, what can science do for art?
Well, one of they work hand in hand, and my work is clearly a combination of the two. You know, and early on, the science was probably more important to me. While I was laying the groundwork for what I do, that study skin was everything, and I would spend time at the museum. I was learning anatomy. I needed to understand the bird from the inside out in order to do what you see here. I needed to understand the skeleton. I needed to understand the musculature, the feather tracks, the feathers themselves, and I took courses in my formal education in ornithology, and that was critical. And then I got involved with the banding program, which is science. It's a function of the Carnegie Museum, and that was critical. But art is critical too, and my work is a blend of the two. At this point, I feel like I know enough of what I'm doing to where there are times when they're at odds with each other. And in a situation like that, I usually try and let art win a little bit. It's still based on science, but and I'll give you one example. The biggest piece that I ever did was two parasitic Jaegers pursuing a tern. This is something that happens in nature. It's a common. Jaegers are pirates. They fill the niche of birds of prey out on the open sea. And these two Jaegers are chasing a tern, and they harass other birds and get them to give up their prey. They steal it, just like a bald eagle will steal a fish from an osprey. Same sort of thing. Well, in this composition, I had this high-speed chase that kind of all funneled toward the lead, which was the tern's bill, and it was a bright red bill, and science would probably have had me put a fish in that bill, but it would mess with the clean lines of my composition. I decided to leave the fish out, and that was me letting art win over science in that small issue. The piece was still sound scientifically. The birds were accurate and all that, but that's what I mean when I say if I'm faced with a dilemma between art and science, I'll let art win a little. Another thing that I'll do is exaggerate more than I used to. Early on, everything was exact, and at this point, I might make a bird bigger than it actually is. I might make a flying bird's wings a little longer. If that enhances the composition that is a part of, I'll cheat a little, knowingly. But I won't cheat so much that people will look at it and say, well, that's just wrong. It enhances the image and makes it more powerful, I'd like to think, but it's not technically it's not accurate. That's another example of art winning over science, but it's all based on science. Little artistic license.
Never hurt anybody.
Make it more real than reality. Well, I think that's fantastic. Don, do you have any more questions? I'm processing right now as I feel how I am.
I guess my last question, Larry, would be, what's your word of advice if someone wants to get started carving, especially like a kid, like a student? What's your word of advice to someone getting started carving?
The more experience you build up, the better you are at this. So just get moving. You know, my first birds were not of this caliber, clearly. But every single thing that I have done has increased my ability to do better. And you know, those first 2 years that I mentioned that I carved without knowing any other carvers, at that time I was the young carver you're speaking of. You know, what should you be doing? I would have loved to have known other carvers and talked shop and found out how to do things. But looking back on it, I cherish the fact that I was on my own for 2 years, because if I had known other bird carvers and I said, well, how should I make feet? They would have told me, and that's how I would have done it. I was better off figuring it out on my own. I firmly believe that those early years carving on my own is what to this day makes my work distinctive and unique, because some of the things that I figured out and some of my approaches to problem solving and to problems is maintained to this day, and we don't want everybody doing it the exact same way. So I like new carvers who don't know what they're not supposed to do, and you see some real creativity there. At the Ward show, there are all the different skill levels, and every year I make it a point to spend some time looking at the novice table, because their skills are not as high, but you see ideas, you see things that are unexpected, and it may have been by mistake, it may have been intentional, but there's some really interesting creativity that is part of the early stages, and before you know what you're supposed to do, and you're just doing things. So I would just encourage anybody to get on with it, carve as much as they can, and spend time in the field looking at the subject, because the motivation is the real bird. And I know a lot of carvers who would benefit from spending more time in the field instead of all their time at the carving bench. It's nice to work directly from the motive, and that requires that you get out in the field and do some bird watching and sketch. My most powerful weapons are my sketchbook and the clay model stage. Neither one of those has anything to do with what chisels I use, what bits I use, what wood I use, what fillers I use, what epoxies I use. You know, I think those are my secret weapons, is my sketchbook from the field and working the piece up in clay. So I would encourage anybody to sketch and draw, and to practice in clay, which is so much more forgiving and less time consuming than wood.
What inspires you these days to keep carving? You've churned out so many astounding pieces. You've won so many awards. You've garnered so many accolades. Like, what keeps you carving every single year? Do you have some more of these quarter-century birds gestating in your study books?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. Composition is the final frontier. You know, I've been carving birds since I was 14. I know how to carve a bird. I don't come across too many new things in the birds themselves, uh, but the composition, presentation, design, and presentation. That's what keeps me going. And at this point, it usually isn't the bird that inspired the piece. It's the concept. It's the idea of a certain setting, and then I pick the bird that best reinforces that and will work best in this concept. But it isn't usually, oh, look at that bird, that's such a beautiful bird, I want to do that. That doesn't really happen very often. That leads to a 25-year process, because you see a bird and you say, that's great. You know, one example would be a kingfisher. One just flew by a little while ago. I love kingfishers. It's a great bird. The only reason that I haven't done a kingfisher yet is because I haven't come up with a concept, an idea for one that is firing on all cylinders for me. I've been trying to do a kingfisher piece for years, and I haven't settled on a composition that just makes me say, that's it, I've got it. And until I come up with that eureka compositional moment, I won't do a kingfisher, even though I'd really love to do a kingfisher. But I wait until the time is right, and it hasn't been right yet. So, you know, when the day that I finally figure out how to present a kingfisher, then I'm excited as can be about carving a kingfisher. So the birds have never faded. But what keeps it interesting is that I'm not doing the same thing all the time, because every piece is different compositionally, presentationally. Sometimes there's no bass, sometimes there's a lot of bass. That's what's, you know, you might say, well, they're all the same. They're all highly detailed, very, very refined birds. And the birds are, but the compositions are different every time. So that keeps the work fresh to me and keeps me going at it.
Fantastic. Well, I hope you get to keep going at it for years and years and years, and I look forward to that kingfisher, because the work is just absolutely astonishing. Ever since I first came to the Ward Museum and got to see your pieces, I've been constantly impressed. So thank you so much, Larry, for joining us today, telling us a little bit about your work and your history and your inspirations. I think it's been, to me, very informative. I am just glad I got to talk to you today. I think it's been really fun, and it's a great celebration of World Migratory Bird Day. Dom, did you have something you wanted to add as well?
Thank you, Larry, and happy World Migratory Bird Day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.